My name is Whitney Sales. I am a general partner and head of global programming for Accelerprise Ventures. We're a B2B SaaS accelerator focused on companies who are pre-seed to seed stage startups. So my specialty is really in helping companies get to their first million. So talking about acquiring your first customers, first 10 customers, first 100 customers. And so what I'm planning on focusing my talk around today is actually how to structure a sales conversation. You guys are all founders. Some of you are probably actively selling, some of you are probably not. If you're not, you need to be. You should be selling all the way through your organization, be involved in your enterprise deals. The most successful founders I see really embrace this role and step up into it. And so I'm going to be going over the structure of a good sales conversation for those salespeople in the room and the founders in the room. So talked a little bit about me. The point of this entire presentation, if you guys are going to get anything from it, is that your customers will actually tell you anything you need to know in order to sell to them. You just have to ask the right questions. So jumping into this, a qualifying meeting. This can be either your demo meeting or it could be your initial sales conversation. The structure of a qualifying meeting, I generally like to break down into context, the why, the what, and the how. So start with the laugh, spend your initial conversation actually connecting with the customer, giving the structure of the conversation and context around what their expectations should be. Jump into why, what your pitch is going to be, what they need to understand and educate about the problem that you try and solve. The what, establish credibility, contextualize the value, and identify the KPIs they're going to measure success by when you actually, when they do actually sell your product or buy your product. And then finally, how. Map your close and confirm and schedule your next steps. We're going to dive into each of these. Cool. So how I started my presentation, typically how I start my presentation with my last name is actually Sales. It's a good way to actually connect with the audience and for you guys to understand a little bit about me and my last name, and I'll talk a little bit about my background. I'll find something or some way to actually connect with the audience in a personal way. It's a really important thing, especially when you're selling to a customer and if it's not something you're particularly comfortable with, to get them to accept you as a human being as opposed to someone trying to push a product on them. Next portion I'll go into is introductions and roles with you guys. So you talk about how you were connected, so you provide context for that initial conversation. From there, go into your title, your role within the organization, and something personal about yourself and you and the company. So it could be how long you've been in the company, it could be part of your responsibilities, something that happened. Again, this is part of contextualizing, connecting with the person. Also find out who they are and what their roles and responsibilities are. Not all titles within an organization are equal the same thing, especially depending on the size of the company, which we'll actually go into today when we talk about roles in sales when the panel is here today. And then from there, how much time you actually have for the meeting. Some people will cut you off when they're tight on time. It's a really good way to check in and show respect. And then the other portion of it is that they may actually run over, which is going to show a little bit more interest in buying signals within that conversation. I have a pro tip on here, which I think is a really important thing to pay attention to. It's in small font, but take notes on who is asking questions and the roles of each person in the room, because it's going to show you how people make decisions across the organization. If you have a CEO who's driving most of the conversation, it may be a top-down organization. If you have lower-level people asking a lot of questions, it's probably going to be a consensus-based organization. If you have someone who's not talking during the conversation, what you can do is actually engage that person and bring it up based on their roles and responsibilities to re-engage them. They may have an objection that you didn't flesh out. So really important to know each person's responsibilities and roles and acknowledge that at the beginning. It's part of the reason we do the introduction. The next piece is set expectations. So ask them if they have anything they'd like to discuss. Mirror the customer's tone. Are they casual? Are they formal? Are they being friendly? Are they jokey? For example, you know Doug, you'll see Doug come up, and Doug will joke around with you guys. He's tons of fun. And so when you interact with them, you want to play. Some people are going to be really serious because maybe they're from the East Coast and in finance, and you need to mirror their stiff posture in their interactions because you need to show that you can actually interact with them. And then that mirroring will actually get them to follow you if you want to break their guard.
But don't stereotype.
Yeah, no, not at all. Then if you're in a meeting or a call, set your goals for the conversation. My goal for this conversation is part of the Sandler method. My goals for this conversation is get an understanding of how you guys currently do whatever you guys solve the pain point for. Discuss how we can potentially help with it if we can. And if we can, from there we can discuss next steps if there's a fit. And then how you want to structure questions. Depending on the culture you're selling into, some people won't actually ask questions unless you tell them how to or when they can. So for example, if you're selling to European countries, not to stereotype, a lot of European people, you have to give permission to ask questions or tell them you're going to pause to ask questions. And so if you don't give people structure on how to actually engage with you, they'll hold their objections the entire time. And people can only manage about 7 threads of thought at a given period of time. So if they have an objection and you don't get it out, they're not paying attention to anything you're saying. So it's really, really important to flesh those out and give them a way to engage. There's a script at the bottom of this. Hal will be sharing this deck as well, so I see a lot of you taking pictures. That's great, but you'll get a copy of it as long as you've provided your email address. So feel free to take photos as well, but you'll be getting it. Pitch. Doug is going to cover this on how to tell your story, so I'll let him do that. But generally, before you start any type of story, understand what they actually know about the company. It's going to be a really good buying signal if they've done research. It's obviously a problem they're trying to solve because they've taken time to educate themselves about your organization and where you might fit in the ecosystem. If they don't know anything and it was an introduction that came through, they're probably doing someone a favor, so you're going to have to do a little bit more work to engage them. Make your pitch relatable. It's a really important piece. Make sure they can understand it. In the VC community, a lot of people did the X of Y. A lot of VCs don't like that anymore, but it's the way that they used to relate to certain contexts or certain products. And then pause for questions after you give a pitch. Your pitch is your initial story or value proposition you're offering a customer, and your founding story. And so you want to pause and give them an opportunity to actually engage with the conversation because there might be an objection that they have, because your founding story is the aha moment that you had that made you develop your product today. And that's your initial pitch and discovery that made you want to start the company. Okay. Understand and educate. So, and your qualifying. So I break up qualifying questions into 2 categories. One of them is my qualifying questions and the other are my sales questions. My qualifying questions I front load at the beginning of my qualifying conversation, and they're designed around what it is I need to know to understand the use case that I'm going to give to that customer. So the story I'm going to tell them that applies to them about the ROI we're going to be providing their business and the problem we're going to be solving for their business. And then also what it is I actually need to know to understand if they're a good customer for me. Because if they're not going to be a great customer for me, I don't want to waste their time, and I definitely don't want to waste my time, especially you guys as founders. Your time is your most valuable resource. And it also will build trust. So if you know they're going to need a certain feature in your product that you don't have right now, it's going to be a really valuable thing to stop that conversation, be like, you know what, I know your business model, it's not a great fit. Let's actually stop. I'm going to put a note in my CRM to come back to you guys when we actually have it. That builds a lot of trust that when you do come back, you do actually have that feature, and you're going to build. They're going to be much more likely to engage with you in a conversation because you establish that credibility from the beginning. Then when I ask my questions, I like to respond with value-based responses. So I have my value-based questions that are going to help me understand the value that I'm actually providing the customer. And then I'm going to follow up with value-based responses. My value-based responses are structured specifically around educating the customer around the pain I'm solving for them. So you can use statistical data around how this problem developed. It could be specifically around the knowledge in the industry about trends that are happening that are causing this to become a bigger problem. It could be around the size of the problem itself that people may not realize. It could be around new technology that's developed that actually has made this available today. All of these things will actually play into establishing your credibility as a thought leader within the space and making it more likely that the customer will buy from you and trust what it is you have to say. One thing I do like to do, and I'm just going to put it in here, is I like casual competitor name dropping in my value-based responses. So if I'm talking about a particular problem that one of my companies has, one of my customers has, I'll talk about how another company may have had that same problem. And we actually talk to them, but here's kind of what I understood about the market and what was going on with the market. So you're not talking about the specific customer and insider information about them, but you are talking about the fact that you've developed knowledge about the industry and how that's something that's actually happening across the industry. Makes it a much more valid problem that they should be solving, especially if you're developing a new market versus an established market, selling in an established market. Any questions so far? I feel like I'm rolling through this. Yes?
Oh, yeah, actually, about the pause for questions when you were giving the pitch. Could you give an example of what kind of questions you would ask?
So I would say, for example, one of the things I always say is I love to hear myself talk, but it's more important to actually hear what you guys have to say. If you guys have any questions, I'd really love it if you raise your hand and interrupt me, because I'd actually love to hear what is resonating with you and what's not, and how I can actually make this more valuable for you. So that's an example of what I would say right now. Another thing could be if you're giving a presentation to a larger group of people, I would say I'm going to be pausing for questions after each section or after each slide. So if you have questions, I would just ask you to write them down, and I'm going to pause after that and ask any questions. But if at any point you have something that's really important before I move on, please stop me and feel free to ask a question. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah.
So for this whole scenario, this whole meeting that
Yeah. Yeah.
What is the standard of how many people are on each side, or who's coming for I'm just trying to
Yeah, so Benchmark has a really great report on on the average number of people who are typically involved in. Yes, sorry about that. So the question was, based on this type of scenario, what's the average number of people who are typically involved in this type of conversation? And what I was referencing is there's a report in Benchmark that was, they published it for 2017. They do one each year on standards for SDR, standard for sales, sales cycle data. It's a really, really valuable report. If you guys don't know some of the standards, it also has comp structures in it. If anyone wants, I'll have my email address at the end of this. If anyone wants it, we can follow up with that information. But it really depends on how enterprise of a sale you're doing, right? So if it's a product that fits under one organization, you may have a manager, and it depends on the price point. So you may have a manager who can decide to purchase the product for their org, or you may have to go higher up within the organization. It depends if you're going to need lawyers involved in the process or security. There might be some privacy laws that you guys are going to have to involve someone in. So it really depends. And fleshing that out, ideally you've identified a champion within the organization who can help you flesh out who needs to be involved based off of what it is you're trying to sell and the price point that you're selling at. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Cool. So customer story, I also have a worksheet on this that's literally fill in the blanks on how to talk about a customer story. So if anyone wants that, please let me know. I'm happy to share it. I'll tweet it out as well. Again, Doug is going to be covering a lot on stories. But on use cases, I use use cases to establish credibility through others. So instead of saying that my product does something, what I talk about is someone who had a similar problem. So I was working with one of my founders recently, and they were having a problem about identifying their target market. And so what we did was actually sit down and suss through their pipeline and what was actually moving forward and what wasn't. And what we found is that he was actually targeting the wrong market for the last 3 months. And then when he looked at which deals were actually moving, there were 2 other markets that if he targeted, the deals would move much faster. And so he's refocused his shift, and now he has 3 times the leads than he did the previous month. So that is an example of how you can actually tell a customer case study. You guys are founders. You have a problem of, you could potentially have a problem of identifying a target market, or you could have a problem of pushing a deal forward, or you could have XYZ problem. And so I sat down and did Y, and the end result was the ROI of 3 times X. Does that make sense? Again, there's a script on this, so I can just give it to you guys, but that's an example. So every use case should tie back to an ROI story. So it should tie back to money or time in some way for that particular customer. It should be the pain point that you're talking about solving for that customer. That is the benefit that you're solving for. There's the benefits of the product, and the end result is the ROI. And so when you talk about your use cases, you should talk about the benefits and the pain that took them there and what the result was. They should tie back to your qualifying questions and the facts that you talked about in qualifying. So if your qualification was about the type of tech stack they were using and how they were using it, when you talk about your use case, you should talk about the customer who is using the same technology and had a similar problem. So it's all tying back through the entire organization or the entire conversation in a thread and showing that you're listening and validating the problem that they have. If you don't have customers yet, I'm not sure how many of you guys do, but if you don't have customers yet, most of you have done customer discovery to flesh out this problem. You should know those problems. You've done your product research to develop a product. You can use your customer stories that you did in your product development as your case studies. Most of them are probably friends. You can say they're not a customer, so you can be honest about it, but you can tie it back via your customer discovery. It doesn't necessarily have to be a closed customer or someone you've had a conversation with. There's lots of ways around not necessarily having customers yet.
Yes. So if you're studying a product that is to B and to C, which use case should you talk about? For example, you're studying a consumer hardware product, which is a target based.
Yeah.
When you try to study based on a target, how do you apply the use case?
So when you're selling a product to 2 companies that are different.
So a company that can sell the product to. So B2B to C.
Oh, B2B to C. Okay, so when you're selling a product to a B2B to C company. So we actually did this at People Data Labs. So People Data Labs is an API for people data. They plug into, pretty straightforward. They plug into CRMs, marketing automation, applicant tracking systems, HRISs, anything with people data, and they keep that people data up to date. Pretty straightforward. But they also would sell directly to people who had large people databases. So they would sell to companies or recruitment firms who had million-person databases. So they could potentially be selling to the software platform that the companies were using, but they would also sell directly to the company. And so kind of a similar situation where you could sell directly to the customer or you could sell to the business, correct? Yeah. So the way that they would talk about it is we would start with, actually in the founding story, his founding story started with a direct, not to consumer, but a direct to another business that was the client of one of the other software companies that we would sell to. He started by selling to those companies, and so we would talk about that particular use case for the company, but then he would also, when we talked about the founding story to the CRMs or the applicant tracking systems, we would add in his first client was Smart Recruiter, and this is all the things that they did for Smart Recruiter. So we just took the sale through to the next sale, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question? No?
I guess more trying to understand the difference. So their end user still is a business, right?
Yeah.
But I'm talking about the case of the end user are individual customer that will be.
Yep.
But it's like how business not that directly selling to site.
So it's a partnership. So more of a partnership. So the end result is not necessarily going to be revenue, but it's going to be a partnership conversation. And the conversation can actually be very similar. It's just a partnership you had with another company. So instead of it being about, and it's still the revenue that you drove, or the client customer acquisition you drove, or the marketing that you drove for them, or et cetera, et cetera. So it's just
found their first partnership right now.
yeah. So it's just
the founder is their first one in college.
got it. We can talk about it afterwards as well if you want. I'm happy to chat with you about it. Okay, so if you don't do demo, if you do a demo on the call, I usually like to do this after I've talked about my customer use cases, because you validated that you can do what you say you can do, and then you show the product and how you can do it. Couple tips around demos. I'm not going to dive into it in this conversation. Show 3 key areas of the demo that are going to apply to the customer, and only those 3 areas. You don't need to go into the entire product. I know as founders, we're all in love with our product. It's great. It's a wonderful thing. But focus on the key areas on why the customer is going to buy, and don't dive into anything else, because it's just going to cause problems. You get in the weeds. So just key tip. The other thing to mention in this is when you use your customer use cases, if you know there are objections that are likely to come up with that particular customer, use your use case and how you talk about your customer to handle that objection. So if you know, for example, someone's going to have an issue with a certain part of the product, you can talk about how the customer thought this was going to be an issue and actually ended up being a really big value add for them. Right? So you can handle the objections you know that are coming as you have more conversations by adding them into the use case. Cool. So your sales questions are specifically focused on how you identify the ROI for your customer. So what do you need to know about what you offer the customer themselves? And then what do you need to know in order to tell the customer story? So your customer story is going to be your ROI story, so in understanding the ROI for that particular customer. These typically are organized around, pain points and metrics. So it's identifying where the needs are and where the pain for this particular customer are. In your responses, the difference between your responses and your qualifying questions and your sales questions is your qualifying questions are designed around establishing credibility and knowledge of your space and trends, and basically establishing the pain point that you solve for. Your sales questions are specifically focused on the emotional pain that this is causing for that person and the organization as a whole, and making them look good. So your responses in your selling should be around, yep, I can understand how that would be a really big issue for your organization. Talk to me a little bit about how this plays out across the org. So, this is a problem. This costs you, 5 weeks. Can you talk me through what that process looks like? Who's involved? Oh wow, so this costs you 5 weeks, but then it costs your team another 4 weeks. Oh, and wow, then there's a business board meeting around it to review everything. What happens if the information's incorrect? Wow, how does that fall back on you? And that really starts to flesh out the pain points that actually relate to the day-to-day of that person, that makes the problem you solve much more relatable and much more valuable for them as people, so they get more motivated to solve for it. It's more urgency around it because they see it. Does that make sense? Okay. Value-based responses, I just want to say, are not pitches. So you're not selling in these. You're understanding and relating and educating. That's it. You're not pitching your product. You're not selling your product. They're about relating. They're educating your customer and relating to their problem. So in your ROI story, once you understand what the problem is and what the value for that customer will be, you go into your ROI. So how will using your product impact their business overall? So I gave you a situation from a pain point perspective. It could be that it's taking them time. It could be that it's costing them money. Money is usually less valuable than time for most people, especially development resources. So understanding how it's actually going to impact their business from a day-to-day and the trickle-down effect across an organization is really, really important when you're talking about the ROI. In your value-based questions, what did you identify as the key benefits for that particular customer? So there's different use cases and there's different ROIs your product's going to have long-term. That's something to pay attention to, and use that when you talk about your ROI for that customer. Again, can you tie the benefit back to the ROI story? So you had the customer story that you gave. Now you're going to give the ROI story. It should be in a similar format. So you said that it's going to cost you this. If we integrate with you guys, this is what I would expect the result to be. I expect to be able to save you XYZ time. And then you have a KPI that you guys are shooting for together. And they have a direct tie to ROI that they can now sell in across their organization. Does that make sense? Cool. This is an area where you basically can tell whether your value proposition and what you're trying to sell lands at this point. So it's a really good place to pause. They'll either engage or they won't. If they engage, they'll engage around like how to implement and process-oriented questions, or they'll give you an objection around whether the product is a good fit for them, or the value or ROI that you're saying, that whether they believe it. And that's, at least they're giving you that information. If they're quiet, that's a problem. Because at this point, you've basically gone through what the value it's going to be for the organization, related to them, talked about what the pain point was, talk through like what the KPIs for success for the org could be. They should have fleshed out the customer story, and you should be able to flesh that information out at this point. When you talk about your ROI, you want to be clear, you want to be concise. You don't want there to be a lot of fluff around it. You want to see if it lands. Okay. There's a tip in there, but you guys can read it later. Final piece that I like, there's two final pieces, and this is kind of your closing piece. Map the close. So if you were to think about your conversation with the customer and identifying value for that particular customer, you've obviously already identified the need. I go through BANT. It's an old school way of thinking about sales, but it's a really good way to make sure that you're going through everything. It's early stage salespeople. It's a great way to look at it. There's also CHAMP, which is worth looking up if you've been selling for a while, and the Challenger sale. But I like to go through this to understand, how is budget going to get allocated? Have they spent money on this type of problem before? What would that process look like? Something around budget as well is people look at money as being a budget, but at this point, if you have any type of implementation, which most of you will, that time allocation is actually the bigger budget you need to be looking at. So when do they have time? Are they on, if it's a development tool, are they on sprints? What do their sprints look like? How do you get something in a sprint? Is a really important thing to be paying attention to. Authority, ideally you've got all the stakeholders in the room when you're having this conversation, but if you don't, you need to understand if there's anyone else who needs to be who would need to see the product or be involved in the process. So legal, if there's any type of privacy concerns, because you're dealing with PII, if you have an integration, there's probably a dev person who's going to be involved. If you're dealing with accounting in some way or finance, they're probably going to need to be involved. Is there a CFO who's going to need to approve the budget? Get them in the meeting, because you need to get your goal as a salesperson is selling and then project management. So problem solving and project management. And the project management piece is aligning everyone around how you're going to get that product through the organization. And then final piece, timeline. Have they ever purchased a tool like this before? What was the process like? And do they have a legal process? Yes?
I think being direct's probably the best, but I'm curious, like, these questions can be really like robotic. So
Yes.
like, do you tend to advise on literally asking them almost like verbatim like this, or are you like working them in a more conversational manner?
Oh, I'm working them in a conversational manner, for sure. And I've tried to structure these in a way that are even less direct than people typically ask them. Like, do you have budget for this is something people will typically ask, and that's not a great way to ask for a budget. It's a, have you ever purchased a tool like this before? Can you talk to me about what that process looked like? You know, do you have, is this something you guys typically allocate resources for? Are you comfortable with working with new technology companies? So you're really, you do want to make it very conversational throughout that process. Yeah?
The comment about getting everybody in the room.
Yeah.
In my experience, it's also just having your different roles in
Yes.
organizations,
Yes.
having different roles.
Yes.
The finance guy is going to be like let's take my budget.
Yes.
Innovation guy can
And can they get the ROI that they're supposed to get? Because there's usually a metric ROI that every a large enterprise organization has.
So in my experience, it's almost like a hierarchy.
Yep.
First, like being the interest of the innovation guy, then go to the board. That one just then the account.
So innovation is typically almost a BD role for startups. So there's like BD that are external large organizations, and innovation is basically scouting for acquisitions, and then startups they can bring into the org and test them out in the org, and then maybe acquire them or like bring them in, depending on how quickly the startup grows. So they're the BD guy, but you could also sell directly to the person who would be purchasing the product. That's usually a faster path because if that person wants it, and that's what the BD guy is going to do. And the BD guy may not necessarily be doing a great job assessing the need, or the innovation guy may not necessarily be doing a great job assessing the needs for every department. It depends on who their buddies are and how they're prioritizing in the organization. So it can be better to sell directly to the person who has the pain point that you solve for, but you're usually harder to get in touch with. But as far as stakeholder goes, you want to build a champion within the organization. I try and build the champion within the group that has the pain point versus the BD. The BDs or the innovation person is typically the intro in, and then stay with the person who has the biggest pain point in the product and use that person to champion and navigate the organization and try and get as many people as possible. You should eventually know who those people are and suggest that to them. Typically, these are the people who are involved in the process. But if you don't know that yet, like, get them to help you figure it out. And larger organizations will have different people, so you need to kind of navigate that. Yeah?
I have a question. What's your perspective on the always be closing attitude? Is that sort of like old school sales, or is it sort of more an approach of how you work it into the conversations as you go through the process?
So the always be closing mentality is more of always have a value hat on than an always be closing. So one thing, for example, I've tried to do throughout my career is I've always tried to find ways to help people. And that's what I try and close them on is like, how can I help this person? Can I make an introduction? Can I do something for them? Because that's just like, that's my personality. And so I also know that comes back. And that's how I've built a huge network that I now use for Accelerprise and why people volunteer their time. And for us is because I've found ways to help people throughout my career. So when I say like, there's the always be closing hat, but it's what are you trying to close people on? And it's not necessarily, like as a founder, it's like it can be helping people because every person you meet in your network can potentially help you in some way down the line. It may be a founder that you meet that's completely unrelated, but you know what? They might know an investor you really want to meet. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not.
Maybe difference if the product is a service?
Does it make a difference if the product is a service, meaning like professional services versus a software as a service? Yes. Not really. I actually helped a friend who is presenting in front of Starbucks board today. So, and it basically the exact same process. So it really does. Everyone has their own style and voice of selling. It's not going to be my voice, but you have to find out what's right for you. Some of you may be more friendship related oriented. Some of you might be more direct. Some of you may be more consultative. Some of you may take a more of a process approach where it's numbers oriented, but everyone will have their own style of selling. So don't feel that, find a person who sells in a similar style to you and learn from them is one thing I would definitely recommend. Cool. And when I say, one thing I want to say around this, map the close, is you should know what's going to happen when you get off the call, when it's going to happen, and who with. And 3 steps ahead of that, because that's how you're going to tighten those sales timelines. Cool. And then finally, and I'm going to wrap up because I know we need to, confirm and schedule your next steps. So don't get off the phone without a time on the calendar. Even if they're not willing to put a time on the calendar, put a time on the calendar for a check-in. Like, just say, hey, I'm going to circle back with you in like 2 weeks. I'm just going to send out a calendar invite so that I make sure we check in. If for some reason that time doesn't work for you, just let me know. But I'll send you a note the day before and just let you know I'm going to be calling. Or I'll be reaching out. So close them on something and make sure that happens. The second thing is make sure that they have homework and you have homework. When people complete your homework, you know that they're taking incremental steps in the buying process. On average, people are going to, To get to a close, there are going to be investments that are made on their end. And if you don't know what those investments are going to be, you need to figure out what they are. It could be signing an NDA that they need to send you. It could be finding out information that you needed for the ROI story. It could be getting other people involved in the process. But those are steps you need to close them on and get them to do. And that's part of project managing and aligning the organization around selling that deal. Set the agenda for the next meeting. And then one thing that's just a tip is clarify your steps and their steps before you get off the call, and make sure you're clear on those and what's actually going to happen. Cool. Thank you.